In an old shoebox, returned to me after 40 years in prison, lies a stack of letters. But I only ever reread one, written on thin blue paper in my late wife's hand. Liz was 7 when I told her you died in an accident. It was a mercy, Arthur. To her, you are a hero, not a convict. I'm begging you, do not destroy that legend. Let your daughter live without the shame of a father. Let her remember you as dead. And for all those years, I honored her request. I was dead. The problem is, I came back to life. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Arthur Morgan. I am 71 years old. 41 of those years were spent inside, where my name was a number and my profession was breathing. Before that, I was an architect. I built things that were meant to last. The final walk was the strangest part. It wasn't a long walk, no longer than the path from my cell to the mess hall, but every step felt like it was stretching time. The concrete floor, polished to a dull sheen by the shuffling feet of generations of ghosts, was the last familiar surface I would ever touch. The guard beside me didn't speak. We had no shared language left. His world was one of keys and clocks, and mine was about to become one of I didn't know what. He stopped at the last steel door, the one that separated the processing rooms from the world. The sound of his key in the lock was not a simple click. It was a percussive, metallic crack, like a bone snapping. The door swung inward, revealing not the sun, but another smaller room, a kind of airlock between my past and my future. In it was a single wooden bench. On the bench was a cardboard envelope and a set of clothes. I changed out of the stiff gray uniform for the last time. Its rough cotton was a known quantity, a second skin I had grown into. The clothes waiting for me were a stranger's, a polyester shirt that felt slick and cold, trousers of a thin, flimsy material, and shoes that felt impossibly light, like they were made of paper. They were the clothes of a free man, but they felt like a costume. I was an actor being pushed onto a stage, having never seen the script. The guard watched me, his face impassive. I put my old uniform in the designated bin. It was a snake shedding its skin. I folded it neatly. It was a habit I couldn't break. I was given the envelope. Inside, I knew, was $200 in cash, a bus ticket to the city, and a set of release papers that reduced 4 decades of my life to a series of bureaucratic stamps. I slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of the cheap jacket. It felt heavy, heavier than it should, weighted with the impossible gravity of a new beginning. Then came the final gate. It wasn't a door, but a massive, rolling cage of steel bars that groaned in protest as it slid open. It moved with agonizing slowness, revealing the world outside, not all at once, but in vertical slices. First, a strip of impossibly green grass. Then, the cracked asphalt of a parking lot. Then, the dazzling chrome of a passing car. For 41 years, the sun had been a rationed commodity, a pale square of light on a concrete floor for 1 hour a day. Now, it was an ocean, and I was drowning in it. I had to raise a hand to shield my eyes, my pupils shrinking to pinpricks, unprepared for the sheer, unfiltered violence of the light. The air was the next shock. It was thick with smells I had long forgotten. The acrid bite of vehicle exhaust, the sweet, cloying scent of freshly cut grass, the distant, greasy promise of fried food from some unseen diner. It was too much. In prison, the air had only one smell: disinfectant, sweat, and despair. This new air felt wild, untamed, and it made my lungs ache. I took the first step. My paper-thin shoes met the gravel of the path, and the crunching sound was so loud it made me flinch. I had forgotten that the world had a texture. I took another step, then another, until I was clear of the gate's shadow. I heard it roll shut behind me, the sound a deep, final clang that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I did not turn to look back. Looking back was a luxury I had unlearned. I stood there for a long time, a man-shaped statue on the edge of a highway. Cars rushed past, capsules of light and sound, moving at a speed that felt reckless and terrifying. The people inside were blurs, faces I couldn't comprehend. They were living in a different timeline, a different reality. A boy, maybe 16, glided past on a wooden board. It moved without his feet ever touching the ground, propelled by a low electric hum that felt like a secret I wasn't privy to. He held a small black mirror in his hand, his face illuminated by its ethereal glow, his thumbs dancing across its surface. He didn't see me. It was as if I was transparent. I watched him until he disappeared, feeling a profound and dizzying sense of displacement. I was an artifact, a relic from a buried civilization, unearthed into a world that had no memory of me. I looked down at my own hands, the skin thin and spotted with age. The hands of Arthur Morgan, architect. The hands that had once held drafting pencils and blueprints, that knew the feel of limestone and steel. The hands that, in one moment of incomprehensible rage, had pushed a man, had ended a life, had destroyed my own. Now they trembled slightly as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one personal item they had allowed me to keep. It was a photograph, its corners softened to felt by decades of touch. The image faded to a pale ghost. A little girl with 2 thick braids and a smile that was missing a front tooth. Elizabeth, my daughter. She was 7 years old in that picture. She would be 48 now. The photograph was my compass and my cross, the only map I had in this new world, and the constant, crushing reminder of everything I had lost. I traced the outline of her small face with my thumb, a ritual I had performed 1,000 times in the dark of my cell. She was a question I had spent a lifetime failing to answer. My instructions were to walk to the bus stop at the end of the access road. It seemed a simple enough task, but as I started walking, the world felt unstable beneath my feet. The sheer openness of the sky, without guard towers or razor wire to frame it, gave me a feeling of vertigo. I felt exposed, vulnerable, a soft target in a world I no longer understood. The bus stop was a simple plexiglass shelter covered in graffiti I couldn't read, a language of scrawls and symbols that belonged to a new generation. I sat on the hard plastic bench. I placed my hands on my knees to stop them from shaking. I looked at the bus schedule, but the numbers and times swam before my eyes, a complex code I couldn't decipher. A bus arrived with a loud hiss of its air brakes, and people got on and off without a second thought, moving with a purpose and confidence that I could only envy. They belonged here. I did not. I let it go, and the one after it. I just sat there, clutching the envelope in my pocket, the faded photograph a secret warmth against my chest, a silent observer watching the impossibly fast, impossibly loud, impossibly bright world rush by without me. The bus ride was a disorienting fever dream. I sat with my body pressed against the cool glass of the window, a flimsy barrier against a world that rushed past in a torrent of incomprehensible data. For 41 years, my world had moved at the pace of a walking man. Now it was a blur of steel, glass, and color that my mind could not process quickly enough. Buildings, taller than I could have imagined, scraped at a sky that seemed too small to contain them. Faces inside other cars were fleeting masks of emotion. A laughing woman, a yelling man, a crying child. Each a miniature drama that was born and died in the space of a heartbeat. I felt a profound sense of nausea, a vertigo that had nothing to do with the lurching motion of the bus. It was the sickness of a time traveler, stranded in an age that was not his own. My instructions were simple, an address scribbled on a piece of paper that was already becoming soft with the sweat from my palm. The building, when I finally found it after asking for directions from a woman who looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, was a monument to neglect. It was a 5-story brick tenement, its face scarred with grime and the ghosts of old fire escapes. It was the kind of building I would have condemned in my old life. Now, it was my home. The air inside was heavy with the ghosts of forgotten meals and the sharp chemical tang of industrial cleaner failing to mask the smell of stale smoke and human desperation. A man with a face like a crumpled paper bag sat behind a plexiglass window and took my papers without looking at me. He pushed a key across the counter. Room 4B. The elevator was out of order, its doors sealed with a sheet of plywood. The walk up the 4 flights of stairs left my lungs burning and my legs trembling. The hallway was a long, dim tunnel lit by single flickering bulbs, the peeling wallpaper revealing layers of paint like the rings of a diseased tree. My room was at the very end. The key scraped in the lock, a sound of protest and decay. I pushed the door open and stepped into my new life. It was a box, smaller than my cell, but a box all the same. There was a single bed pushed against one wall, its metal frame painted a drab, institutional gray. The mattress was thin, and when I pressed a hand against it, I could feel the hard, unyielding springs beneath. A small wooden desk, its surface a geography of cigarette burns and carved initials, was crammed into the corner. Beside it was a straight-backed chair that looked like it had been salvaged from a schoolhouse. A bare bulb hung from a frayed cord in the center of the ceiling, casting a weak yellow light that seemed to be absorbed by the water-stained walls. But my attention was drawn to the window. It was the first thing I had looked for. For decades, a window had been a symbol of everything I didn't have. This one was tall and narrow, its glass streaked with dirt. I walked towards it with a sense of reverence, a pilgrim approaching a shrine. I looked out, expecting to see the city, the sky, a piece of the world I had been denied. The view was a solid wall of brick, no more than 4 feet away. It was so close I could see the fine cracks in the mortar, the subtle variations in the color of the clay, from a deep bloody red to a pale, fleshy pink. A single stubborn weed, a shock of defiant green, grew from a fissure near the top. This was my view, my freedom, a different wall. I stood there for a long time, my forehead pressed against the cool, grimy glass. It wasn't despair I felt. Not exactly. It was a kind of cosmic irony, a quiet, bitter joke the universe was telling at my expense. I had traded one cage for another, slightly larger one. The room was a perfect metaphor for my existence, a confined space with a view of nothing but the past. The next day was for the system to reclaim me. The parole office was a different kind of prison, one made of beige plastic chairs and flickering fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. I sat for 2 hours, watching other men, younger, angrier men, get called in and spit back out. When my name was finally called, I entered an office that was a fortress of filing cabinets. My parole officer, a man named Miller, did not look up when I entered. He gestured to a chair while his eyes scanned a file on his desk. My file, 41 years of my life, reduced to a stack of paper 1 inch thick. He spoke in a monotone, a voice worn smooth by reciting the same litany of rules to thousands of broken men. He detailed my curfew. He outlined the mandatory job search requirements. He explained the weekly check-ins. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a black plastic device with a strap, the ankle monitor. He told me to roll up my trouser leg. As he fastened the strap around my ankle, the plastic cool against my skin, the finality of my situation settled over me. It was a shackle, a leash, a constant physical reminder that my freedom was conditional, a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. At 71 years old, I was being treated like an errant child. I walked out of that office not feeling like a man rejoining society, but like an animal, tagged and released into a tightly controlled preserve. I spent the next few days in a fog, following the rules, eating tasteless food in a crowded soup kitchen, returning to my room before the curfew. The silence of the room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I needed a destination, a purpose beyond mere survival. The public library. The idea came to me like a lifeline. It was a place of quiet, a place of order. The walk there was an ordeal. The city was a sensory assault, a relentless barrage of noise and movement that left me feeling small and fragile. I kept my eyes on the pavement, navigating by instinct, an old animal trying to find its way through an alien landscape. The library was a cathedral of silence. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, shutting out the chaos of the street. The air smelled of old paper and floor polish, a scent of knowledge and peace. I watched people move between the shelves with a quiet reverence. Here, finally, was a piece of the world that made sense. But my purpose was not in the books. It was in the back of the room, where a row of computers sat on long tables. I had never touched a machine like this before. I watched a young woman for 10 minutes, observing how her fingers flew across the keyboard, how she manipulated the small sculpted object next to it. The mouse. I sat down at an empty terminal. The screen glowed to life, an empty white page, a blank slate. It took me a full minute to locate the letters of my name. A-R-T-H-U-R. My fingers felt clumsy and stupid, like thick sausages trying to perform surgery. Then, the search. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. I typed her name. Elizabethmorgan. Each letter was a prayer and a curse. I hit the enter key, a loud, definitive click in the silent room. A list of blue words appeared. My eyes scanned the text, and I found it. Morgan Arts, a gallery. There was a link. My hand trembled as I guided the arrow of light over the words and clicked. The page that loaded was a world away from my own. It was a space of clean white lines, of elegant minimalist design. It spoke of money, taste, and success. It was the kind of space I used to design. And then I saw her. There was a section labeled, About the Director. I clicked, and her face filled the screen. It was her. The same dark eyes, the same determined set of her jaw, but everything else was the work of a stranger. Her face had the fine lines of a life lived, of laughter and worry I had no part in. Her hair was cut short and styled in a way that was both professional and effortlessly chic. She wore a simple black dress and a string of pearls. She was smiling, but it was not the open, gap-toothed smile from the photograph in my pocket. It was a polite, controlled smile, the kind one presents to the world as a shield. I stared at the screen, at this beautiful, successful, powerful stranger who was my daughter. A wave of pride, so fierce and so pure it stole my breath, washed over me, and right behind it came a tsunami of grief. A bottomless, soul-crushing sorrow for the 41 years I had been a ghost, for the man who should have been by her side, for the father who had died, so that inmate 73406 could live. I sat there, an old man in a public library, staring at a picture on a glowing screen, a ghost looking at a life he had created, but was forbidden to haunt. For 3 days, the web page was my entire world. I would walk to the public library every morning and sit at the same computer terminal, the one in the corner that offered a sliver of privacy. I would type her name, my fingers slowly gaining a clumsy familiarity with the keyboard, and wait for the gallery's home page to load. It was a ritual. I studied every photograph of her as if it were a sacred text, trying to decipher the woman she had become from the pixels on a screen. I traced the lines of her face on the dusty monitor, memorized the professional curve of her smile, the confident way she held her head. I was a scholar studying a foreign civilization, her civilization. I read the address of the gallery so many times that the street name and number were burned into my memory, a permanent fixture in the barren landscape of my mind. The decision to go was not a single event, but a slow, gathering tide of need that eventually eroded the shores of my fear. What right did I have to appear before her? I was a ghost, a name in a file, a shameful secret she had likely spent a lifetime burying. The scenarios that played out in my head were all catastrophic. She would scream. She would call for security. She would collapse. The worst one, the one that kept me awake in my narrow bed at the halfway house, was that she would look at me with utter contempt, her eyes filled with the righteous hatred she was entitled to feel. But beneath the fear was a current of hope, as irrational and as powerful as gravity. It was the simple animal need to see my child in the flesh, to breathe the same air, to confirm that she was real, that this incredible woman on the screen was truly the evolution of the little girl in the faded photograph I kept hidden in my pocket. That need, in the end, was stronger than the fear. The morning I chose to go, I prepared myself as a soldier prepares for battle. I washed my cheap polyester shirt in the basin of the communal bathroom, using a small sliver of soap, and hung it over the back of my chair to dry, trying to smooth out the worst of the wrinkles with the palm of my hand. I shaved with a dull, disposable razor, my reflection a distorted stranger in the cracked and mildewed mirror. The face that stared back at me was a roadmap of failure. The skin was thin, almost translucent over the bones. The eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, and the lines around my mouth were not from laughter. I tried to see the architect I once was in that face, the young man with a future. I saw nothing but an inmate. Still, I did my best. I combed my thin gray hair with my fingers. I put on the least worn of my 2 shirts. I was polishing a ruin, trying to make it presentable. The bus ride to her part of the city was a journey to another country. The landscape outside the window transformed slowly. The gritty, dilapidated storefronts and graffiti-scarred walls of my neighborhood gave way to clean, tree-lined streets. The buildings were no longer squat brick structures, but elegant brownstones and towers of glass. The people on the sidewalks were different too. They moved with an unhurried grace, dressed in clothes that fit them perfectly, their faces relaxed and confident. I felt my own shabby attire like a physical weight, a sign that screamed I did not belong. I was a piece of debris washed up on a pristine shore. I got off the bus, and the air itself felt different. It smelled of money, of expensive perfume and clean pavement. I found the street easily, and there it was, Morgan Arts. The name was written in simple, elegant silver letters on a large plate glass window. Her name, my name. Seeing it there, affixed to this beautiful, successful enterprise, sent a strange, painful jolt through me. For a moment, a foolish, insane flicker of pride. I did not go in. Not yet. I crossed the street and stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, a spy in my own life's story. I watched for nearly an hour. I saw people enter and leave. They were like the people on the street, well-dressed and poised. They would pause at the window, look at the large abstract sculpture displayed there, and then push open the heavy glass door. I watched her through the window. She moved through the space with an easy, commanding grace. She would greet guests, gesture towards a painting, laugh a soundless laugh. She was the sun around which this small, elegant planet revolved. Finally, I could wait no longer. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I checked my reflection in a dark shop window, a futile gesture, and then I stepped off the curb. Crossing the street felt like stepping off a cliff. The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the traffic faded to a dull roar. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. My hand, when it reached for the cool steel handle of the gallery door, was trembling. I pushed. The silence was the first thing that struck me. The cacophony of the city was instantly gone, replaced by a deep, reverent hush. The air was cool and still, carrying a faint, clean scent of something I couldn't identify, something sterile and expensive. My worn shoes made no sound on the polished concrete floor. The walls were impossibly white, stretching up to a high ceiling where track lights illuminated massive canvases of chaotic, beautiful color. The art was a language I did not speak, but I could feel its power. This was her world. She had built this. And then I saw her. She was standing near the back of the gallery, her back to me, speaking with an elderly couple. Her voice was low and musical. I could not make out the words, only the gentle, confident cadence. I stood frozen just inside the door, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. I felt like a burglar, a trespasser who had stumbled into a sacred space. I waited. It felt like an eternity. The couple she was speaking with finally nodded and moved away. For a moment she was alone, adjusting a small plaque on the wall next to a painting. This was it. My feet began to move, seemingly of their own volition. I walked across the vast, empty space of the gallery floor. Every step felt magnified, every shuffle of my worn shoes a desecration of the perfect silence. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on me, a dozen quiet inquiries. Who was this old man in the ill-fitting clothes? He did not belong here. I stopped a few feet behind her. I could smell her perfume, a light floral scent. I cleared my throat, a small, pathetic sound. She turned, and my world stopped. Her eyes, the same dark, intelligent eyes from the photograph, met mine. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing, just polite, professional curiosity. I opened my mouth, and my name, my own name, came out as a hoarse whisper. Arthur. I saw it then. A flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible disturbance deep in her eyes. It wasn't shock. It wasn't joy. It was the dawning of an unwelcome, impossible thought, the kind of cognitive dissonance one feels when seeing a ghost in broad daylight. Her professional smile faltered for less than a heartbeat. Her face, for one terrifying moment, went utterly blank. And then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. A smooth, impenetrable wall of polite neutrality descended. She looked at me, not as a father, not even as a man, but as a problem, an unexpected variable that needed to be managed. Before I could say another word, she saw another guest approaching over my shoulder. She gave me a single sharp nod, a gesture of pure dismissal. And then she turned her back on me and walked away, her posture perfect, her smile once again fixed in place as she greeted the other person. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a statue in the center of her perfect white gallery. The other patrons now looked away from me, a collective silent agreement to ignore the unpleasantness. The silence in the room was now heavy, accusatory. I had brought something ugly into this beautiful place. I had brought the past into her present. Slowly, my body began to work again. I turned and walked back towards the door. The journey felt 100 times longer than the approach. I did not look back. I pushed the heavy glass door and stepped back out onto the street. The noise of the city crashed over me like a wave. The sun was too bright. The air was too thick. But I felt nothing. Inside, there was only a profound, echoing silence, the sound of a door that had been shut, quietly but definitively, in my face for the rest of time. The days that followed my visit to the gallery bled into one another, a uniform, featureless gray. The silence of my rejection was a constant ringing in my ears, a high-frequency sound that blocked out the rest of the world. I had imagined many outcomes for that first meeting, a whole spectrum of disasters from shouting matches to tearful accusations. I had never, in all my years of rehearsing the scene in my mind, prepared for the quiet, antiseptic nullity of being looked at as if I were a stranger. Not a monster, not a ghost, just an inconvenient piece of furniture in the pristine gallery of her life. That look had hollowed me out. The fragile purpose that had propelled me from my cell, across the city, and to her door, had vanished, leaving a vacuum in its place. I stopped going to the library. The glowing screen of the computer now felt like a portal to a world I was permanently locked out of. My routine became a simple, mechanical loop designed to pass the hours until I could sleep. I would wake in my small room, stare at the brick wall that was my only view, walk to the soup kitchen for a meal I barely tasted, and then walk the city streets for hours, choosing the roughest, most anonymous neighborhoods where a man like me would not stand out. I was a ghost again, haunting the periphery, and this time the condition felt permanent. My only connection to the modern world was the cheap plastic phone the halfway house had issued me. It was a block of black plastic that felt alien in my hand. For a week it remained inert, a silent brick I carried in my pocket out of obligation. Then, one afternoon, as I sat on my bed watching dust motes dance in the single shaft of light from the window, it vibrated. The buzz was violent against the silent room, a sudden electric shock. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy on the smooth surface. A small light was blinking on the screen. It took me several tries to unlock it, my thumb swiping uselessly at the glass. Finally, an icon appeared. A message. My heart, an organ I had thought long since numb, gave a hard, painful lurch. With a trembling finger, I tapped the screen. The words appeared in a clean, sans serif font, stark and black against the white background. They were devoid of any warmth, any preamble. I'm having a birthday party on Saturday. Here is the address. You can come if you want. Liz. I read the message once, then twice, then a dozen times. The words did not change. It was a communication so stripped of emotion it felt like a legal notice, a summons. It was not an olive branch. It was a gauntlet, thrown down from a great and unreachable height. The address was for a home in a suburb I knew I could not afford to even walk through. The name at the end, Liz, was the name of a stranger. My daughter, the little girl in the photograph, was Elizabeth. The final 3 words were the cruelest part. If you want. It was a phrase that offered a choice while simultaneously making it clear that either option was met with indifference. It was a test. To decline would be to accept my erasure, to quietly disappear as she had asked. To accept would be to willingly step into the heart of her world, a world where I had no place, no history, no context. The invitation did not bring me joy. It brought a new and more sophisticated form of torment. For 2 days, I was paralyzed by indecision. I would walk the streets, the phone a leaden weight in my pocket. The words of the message burned into my mind. I would sit in my room and stare at the brick wall, seeing her face in the cracks and fissures of the mortar. The gallery had been neutral ground, a public space. Her home was a sanctuary, a place filled with the artifacts of a life she had meticulously built in my absence. To enter it would be a form of sacrilege. I would see her husband, her son, the furniture she had chosen, the pictures on her walls. I would be a walking embodiment of the one piece of her history that did not fit into that perfect composition. The humiliation would be immense. And yet, the apathetic cruelty of the message contained within it a single glittering shard of possibility. She had not ignored me. She had acknowledged my existence, however coldly. It was a door, cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light into my dark room. To not go through it felt like a cowardice I could not afford. It would be the final nail in the coffin of Arthur Morgan. I had to go. Once the decision was made, a new kind of anxiety took hold. I had been summoned, and I had to prepare. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror was my first and most immediate problem. I looked like what I was, a relic. My preparation was a meticulous, almost pathetic ritual of attempting to reclaim a shred of dignity. I had 2 shirts, I chose the one with the less frayed collar and spent an entire afternoon washing it by hand in the small sink, using a sliver of soap I had saved. I hung it to dry and then spent an hour trying to press it by laying it flat on my bed and placing my thin mattress over it. The result was a series of new, strange wrinkles, but it was the best I could do. I counted my money. After buying a monthly bus pass, I had just under $100 left to my name. A gift was required. It was an unbreakable rule of the world I used to know. But what do you give to a woman who owned a world of art when all you owned was a room with a view of a wall? The thought of the gift consumed me for a day. I walked for miles, peering into the windows of pawn shops, their glass filled with the sad, forgotten treasures of other people's lives. A silver locket? Too personal. A book? I had no idea what she read. I felt a rising panic. To arrive empty-handed would be the ultimate admission of my own destitution, a confirmation of my failure as a man, as a father. The solution came from an unexpected place. On a street corner, a vendor was selling plants from a small, rickety cart. There were flowers, bright and loud, but my eyes were drawn to a collection of small, potted succulents. They were humble plants, architectural in their strange, geometric shapes. They were resilient, designed by nature to survive in the harshest conditions, to hold on to life with a stubborn, silent tenacity. I saw a reflection of my own desperate hope in them. I chose the smallest one, a single perfect rosette of pale green leaves in a simple terracotta pot. I paid the vendor with my carefully folded bills. Holding the small weighted pot in my hands, I felt a sense of purpose. It was a small living thing, a beginning. It was the first gift I had purchased for anyone in 41 years. On the night before the party, I could not sleep. I sat on the chair at my desk, the small plant before me like a silent companion. The city hummed outside my window, a distant alien sound. I rehearsed my arrival in my mind, a pointless exercise in self-torture. I imagined myself standing at her door, holding my small, pathetic gift. I imagined the faces of the other guests turning to look at me, their polite smiles freezing, their eyes filled with questions. I saw myself navigating her home, a ghost in a place filled with life. The fear was a physical presence in the room, a cold hand gripping my heart. But beneath the fear, there was something else, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a fragile, terrifying, and utterly indestructible kernel of hope. A father was going to see his daughter on her birthday. It was the simplest thing in the world, and the most impossible. The bus journey to her home was a slow, deliberate passage into another dimension. With each stop, the city's rough, chaotic energy receded, replaced by a deep, manicured silence. The landscape outside my window softened into a world of impossible neatness. Vast green lawns, perfectly pruned hedges, and large, immaculate houses that sat far back from the road like sleeping giants. I was the only person on the bus for the last few miles. When I stepped off at my designated stop, the silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. The air was different here, cleaner, scented with chlorophyll and the faint, sweet smell of sprinkler water on warm asphalt. I checked the address on the crumpled piece of paper one last time and began to walk. Every house I passed was a fortress of quiet prosperity. Through large picture windows, I caught glimpses of lives I could barely comprehend. Kitchens of gleaming stainless steel, living rooms with soaring ceilings, art on the walls. I felt the gaze of unseen eyes from behind those windows. A 71-year-old man in a cheap, wrinkled shirt, walking through a neighborhood where people only traveled by car. I was a flaw in the perfect picture, a smudge on a pristine lens. Her house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was not a mansion, but it was a masterpiece of quiet, modern architecture. It was made of glass, dark wood, and stone, designed to blend with the landscape. It was the kind of house I once dreamed of designing myself. Music, a low, rhythmic pulse, and the bright, cascading sound of laughter drifted through the open windows, a stark contrast to the reverent silence of the street. I stood on the sidewalk for a full 5 minutes, my feet rooted to the spot, clutching the small potted succulent in my sweating hand. It felt impossibly small and foolish. Finally, I forced myself to walk up the stone pathway. Ringing the doorbell took a summoning of will I hadn't realized I still possessed. The door was opened by her. Elizabeth. She was more beautiful than her photograph. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her face was flushed with the warmth of the party. When she saw me, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her features. A brief tightening of her jaw, a momentary loss of light in her eyes. It was there and gone in a second, replaced by a bright, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She had been expecting other guests, friends, and my appearance was a brief, jarring note in the symphony of her evening. She took a half-step back to let me in. The hug was a brief, brittle formality. She leaned in, her arms barely touching my back, her cheek brushing against mine for a cold, scentless moment before she pulled away. It was the first time I had held my daughter in 41 years, and I felt nothing but the vast, empty space between us. I offered her the plant. She looked at it for a second, her smile unwavering, took it from my hand, and placed it on a crowded entryway table next to a collection of expensive-looking wine bottles and a large, professionally wrapped gift box. My small living offering was instantly lost, an anonymous tribute among many. She turned and guided me by the elbow into the heart of the noise. A man with a kind, handsome face approached us, her husband. "Mark, this is Arthur," she said, her voice clear and pleasant. "Not my father, just Arthur." Mark shook my hand. His grip was firm, his smile genuine but brief. He was a man accustomed to meeting dozens of his wife's acquaintances. I was just one more face in the crowd. And then, they were gone, swept back into the current of the party, leaving me standing alone in the entryway of a life I did not recognize. The house was a museum of their happiness. I began to drift through the rooms, a ghost at my own daughter's celebration. I kept to the edges, my back to the walls, trying to make myself as small as possible. The space was open and filled with light. Every surface was covered with evidence of a rich, full life. On a bookshelf, I saw a row of framed photographs. There was one of their wedding day. She was radiant, laughing into Mark's eyes. There were pictures of a young boy, my grandson, growing up year by year, a baby in a bathtub, a small boy on a bicycle, a teenager in a soccer uniform. There were pictures of them on vacation, standing before mountains and oceans I had only ever seen in books. In every frame, there was joy, connection, and history. A history from which I had been surgically removed. There was not a single image of me. I did not exist here. The guests were a tribe, speaking a language of shared jokes and casual intimacy. They talked of stock options and preschool applications, of trips to Italy and renovations on their summer homes. Their laughter was a constant rolling wave that I could not ride. No one spoke to me. I was an anomaly, an old man in a cheap shirt who didn't fit. My invisibility was a cloak, and I wrapped myself in it. A young woman from a catering company offered me a glass of wine. I took it, my hand clumsy on the delicate stem. I held it for the rest of the night, never taking a sip, using it as a prop, a reason to be standing in a corner. I watched my daughter. She was magnificent. She moved through the party like a conductor, orchestrating conversations, refilling glasses, touching an arm here, sharing a private joke there. She was the vibrant, living center of this universe she had created. I watched her talk to Mark, a quiet moment where he brushed a stray piece of hair from her face, an act of such simple, profound intimacy. It felt like a blow to my chest. I felt a surge of pride so immense it was physically painful, immediately followed by an abyss of loss so deep I thought I might fall into it. The climax of the evening came without warning. The lights dimmed. Mark appeared from the kitchen holding a large cake, its surface ablaze with dozens of tiny candles. The room erupted into the familiar song. "Happy birthday to you." I stood at the very back of the crowd, pressed against a cool wall of glass, my lips frozen. I could not sing. The sound would not come out. I watched her face, illuminated by the warm, flickering candlelight. She was smiling, her eyes closed as her friends and family sang to her. In that moment, she looked like a child again. She looked like the 7-year-old girl in my photograph. The song ended. She took a deep breath, made a wish, and blew. The tiny flames vanished into wisps of smoke, and the room erupted in applause. My hands remained at my sides. I saw my grandson, Leo, across the room. He caught my eye for a moment, his expression one of pure curiosity, before his mother drew his attention away. The moment was gone. The lights came up. The party resumed its cheerful hum, but for me, something had ended. I knew it was time to leave. I had seen what I had come to see. I had confirmed my own non-existence. I looked for Elizabeth to say goodbye, but she was surrounded, cutting the cake, laughing as someone smeared a bit of frosting on her nose. To interrupt would have been another intrusion, another dissonant note. It was better this way. I slipped back towards the entryway, a ghost making his quiet exit. I saw my small plant on the table, looking lonely and out of place. I turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool, dark night. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing me out once more. The sound of the party faded as I walked down the stone path and onto the silent street. I walked for a long time, under the pale, sterile glow of the streetlights, not waiting for the bus, just walking. The image of my daughter's face, radiant in the light of the birthday candles, the only thing illuminating the profound and cavernous darkness inside of me. I had found a defensible position in the architecture of the party. It was a small alcove near a set of tall glass doors that led out onto a stone patio, a space just outside the main currents of conversation. From here I could observe without being observed, a ghost haunting the margins of the celebration. The untouched glass of wine in my hand served as my passport to this corner, a prop that justified my static presence. For more than an hour, I had simply watched. I watched the ebb and flow of the guests, a tide of expensive fabrics and easy laughter. I watched the caterers move with silent efficiency through the crowd. I watched my daughter, Elizabeth, the radiant center of this universe, her every gesture a study in practiced grace. But most of all, I found my gaze repeatedly drawn to the boy, my grandson. His name was Leo. I had learned it from a framed certificate on a bookshelf, an award for excellence in science. He was 16, poised on that awkward precipice between boyhood and manhood. He had his mother's dark, serious eyes, but his mouth was set in a line I recognized from a photograph of my own father. He was tall and lean, and he moved with the lanky, uncoordinated grace of an athlete who was still growing into his own body. He was surrounded by a small group of friends, other boys his age, and their interactions were a foreign language of inside jokes and playful shoves. I watched him with a strange, painful mix of detachment and intense connection. I was studying a biological miracle, a continuation of my own bloodline, yet I felt as disconnected from him as I did from a character in a novel. I searched his face for some echo of my own, some shared trait that would serve as a bridge across the chasm of my 41-year absence. I found nothing. He was a product of this world, of this beautiful house, of a life of stability and privilege I had forfeited the right to provide. The party continued its cheerful, humming rhythm. The music was a low, pleasant thrum beneath the chatter. I remained in my corner, a silent witness, a fixture in the room that no one noticed. Then, something shifted. Leo detached himself from his friends, who were now engrossed in something on one of their small, glowing black mirrors. He stood alone for a moment, surveying the room, and his eyes landed on me. It was not a passing glance. His gaze did not slide off me as everyone else's had. It held. It was a look of pure, undisguised curiosity, the kind of direct, analytical stare that only the very young are capable of. My entire body tensed. My breath caught in my chest. After a lifetime of making myself invisible, I had been seen. My first instinct was to look away, to break the connection and retreat back into my comfortable anonymity. But I couldn't. His gaze was a physical tether, and it held me fast. He began to walk towards me. It was not a direct path. He navigated the clusters of guests with a casual, weaving motion, but his trajectory was unmistakable. My heart began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. It felt as though the air in the room was thinning, as if the cheerful noise of the party was receding into a distant roar. All of my senses were focused on the approaching boy. He was a walking question, and I had no answers. My mind, a place that had been my only sanctuary for decades, was a sudden chaotic blank. What could I say to him? Who was I in this context? I was not a grandfather. I was a secret, a shameful footnote in his mother's history, and my very presence here was a violation of some unspoken treaty. I braced myself, my knuckles white on the stem of my wine glass. He stopped a few feet in front of me. He was taller than I had realized. He had to look down slightly to meet my eyes. He didn't smile, but his expression was not unkind. It was simply open, inquisitive. He tilted his head, a silent query. "Who are you?" I felt a muscle in my jaw twitch. I managed a small, tired smile of my own, a pathetic offering that answered nothing. He gestured vaguely at the room, at the party, his eyebrows raised as if to ask how I fit into all of this. I could only offer a slight shrug, a gesture of my own profound ignorance. He then pointed to a large, chaotic painting on the wall near us, a violent splash of reds and blacks. He looked from the painting to me, another silent question in his eyes. What did I think? I looked at the canvas, a piece of art that was probably worth more than I had earned in my entire pre-prison life. I did not understand it. I shook my head, a quiet admission of my own inadequacy in this world of culture and taste. He seemed to accept this. Then his gaze became more direct. He gestured at me, at my face, a simple silent prompt. "What about you?" And there it was. The question I could not answer. The space that should have been filled with stories of a shared past, of grandfatherly advice, of a life lived, was a perfect, silent void. My smile faded. I looked down at the wine swirling in my glass, its dark red color suddenly reminding me of something I had spent a lifetime trying to forget. I could not speak. I could not explain the chasm that separated us. I was a black hole, and he had strayed too close to the event horizon. It was then that I saw her from across the room. Elizabeth. She had been talking to a group of friends, her face animated and laughing, but her laughter had frozen. Her eyes were fixed on us, on me and her son. The social mask, the one she had worn so perfectly all night, had vanished. In its place was a look of raw, primal panic. It was the face of a mother seeing her child approach a cliff edge. It was the first true, unguarded emotion I had seen from her, and it was terrifying. She did not run. She moved. She cut through the crowd with a swift, silent purpose, her smile back in place but brittle now, a thin veneer of glass over a raging fire. She arrived at our silent tableau and placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. Her touch was light, but I could see her fingers pressing into the fabric of his shirt. It was a gesture of ownership, of reclamation. She said something to him, her voice too low for me to hear, a quiet, urgent command. Leo looked from his mother's tense face to my own, his expression now one of complete confusion. He was a boy, caught between two opposing magnetic fields. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then closed it. He gave me one last, questioning look before turning and allowing his mother to steer him away, back into the safety of the crowd. She had built a wall between us. Now she turned back to me. The guests and the party and the music all disappeared. There was only her face, her eyes. The politeness was gone. The indifference was gone. What remained was a cold, hard fury. It was the protective anger of a lioness. Her eyes were chips of ice, and they delivered a message far clearer than any words could have conveyed. You will not touch him. You will not speak to him. You will not contaminate my son with your past. The silence between us stretched for a long, brutal moment. It was a silent declaration of war. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask was back. She turned, her posture once again impossibly elegant, and glided back into the party, leaving me alone in my corner, the air crackling with the aftermath of her silent rage. The wineglass in my hand felt as heavy as a block of granite. I was no longer an invisible ghost. I was something far worse. I was a known poison, a plague carrier, and I had just been served with a restraining order written in the universal language of a mother's fear. The birthday party had been a necessary amputation. It had severed the last gangrenous strand of hope that a place could be made for me in my daughter's life. The rejection at the gallery had been a locked door. The panicked, hostile glare she had given me over her son's shoulder had been a wall of reinforced steel. I understood my role now. I was not a father seeking reconciliation. I was a contamination, a living plague vector, and my very presence was a threat to the pristine, carefully constructed world she inhabited. A rational man would have accepted this. He would have taken the bus to another state, changed his name, and dissolved back into the anonymity from which he had emerged. But the 41 years inside had eroded my rationality, leaving behind something more elemental, more primal, a need not for connection, but for knowledge. I could not be a part of her life, but I could be its silent witness. I could become an archaeologist of her present, carefully unearthing the fragments of her existence to piece together a mosaic of the woman she had become. It was a form of self-torture, I knew, but it was also the only form of penance that felt real. My days took on a new clandestine rhythm. I would wake before dawn in my small room, the first gray light filtering through the grimy window to reveal the familiar landscape of the brick wall. I would take the first bus of the morning, riding its empty, echoing shell out of the city and into the quiet, sleeping suburbs. Her street was always silent at that hour, the large houses still dark, the lawns slick with dew. I found a park bench 2 blocks away from her home, a position partially obscured by a thick, overgrown lilac bush. This became my outpost. From there, I would watch her house come to life. A single light would appear in an upstairs window, then another. I would imagine the quiet domestic rituals taking place within, the brewing of coffee, the rustle of a newspaper, the low murmur of conversation. I was constructing a life for her in my mind, a fiction based on the barest of observable facts. The first sign of life was always her husband, Mark. He would emerge from the front door around 7, a briefcase in one hand, a travel mug of coffee in the other. He would get into his sleek, dark car and drive away, a man of purpose heading into a world I did not know. About an hour later, my grandson, Leo, would appear. He would walk down the driveway, a backpack slung over one shoulder, white wires dangling from his ears. He never seemed to look at the world around him, his attention entirely consumed by the music or voices being piped into his head from the small black mirror he held. I watched him with a strange, detached fascination. He was my blood, my lineage, Yet he was as alien to me as the strange humming board the other boy had been riding on my first day of freedom. Then, finally, sometimes, I would see her. Elizabeth. She would come out to retrieve the morning paper from the end of the driveway, or to water the planters that flanked the front door. In these moments, she was not the poised gallery director or the perfect party hostess. She was just a woman, dressed in a simple robe, her hair uncombed, her face free of makeup. It was in these unguarded moments that I saw the ghost of the little girl in my photograph. I would see it in the way she tilted her head to the sun, or in the slight frown of concentration as she examined a drooping flower. These glimpses were rare and fleeting, and they were everything. I would sit on my bench until the street was empty again. Then I would take the bus back to the city, the precious, stolen fragment of her morning clutched tight in my mind. Her gallery was another site of my pilgrimage. I could not go inside again. I was permanently exiled from that clean, white space. But I could watch it from the coffee shop across the street. I would buy a single cup of black coffee, an expense that felt like an indulgence, and sit at a small table by the window for hours. I learned her professional rhythm. She arrived around 10, always looking immaculate, her public face firmly in place. I watched her greet her staff, watched her direct the installation of new exhibits. Once I saw her guiding workmen as they positioned a massive steel sculpture. She communicated with them not with words, but with her hands, her fingers gracefully sketching lines and angles in the air, her expression one of intense, focused precision. It was the gesture of an architect. It was a gesture I recognized as my own. The sight of it, this ghost of me moving through her, was a physical blow. It was a thread, a single microscopic thread connecting our two separate universes. It was a connection that only I would ever know existed, but the soccer field was where the true pain lay. I had found the schedule for the high school team on a community bulletin board outside the library. Leo was a midfielder. I started attending the games. I never sat in the bleachers with the other parents, with their folding chairs and their team banners. I would stand at the far end of the field, leaning against the chain-link fence, a solitary figure partially hidden by the shade of a large oak tree. From this distance, I was just another anonymous old man watching a children's game. The first time I saw Leo score a goal, a feeling I had not experienced in 4 decades surged through my chest. It was pure, unadulterated pride. My grandson. I had to physically restrain myself from shouting out, from joining the chorus of cheering parents. My role was to be a silent witness, not a participant. I would watch Elizabeth and Mark on the sidelines. They were model parents. They shouted encouragement. They clapped for good plays, for both teams. I watched Elizabeth pace the sideline when the game was close, her body tense, her fists clenched. I saw her run to Leo during a break, handing him a water bottle, ruffling his sweaty hair. I watched her being a mother. I saw the easy, unconditional love in her every gesture, a love she had been forced to live without from her own father. These moments of normal, beautiful family life were the hardest to watch. They were a window into the very heart of what I had lost, what I had thrown away. I was a ghost haunting the edges of a family portrait, a phantom limb they had long since learned to live without. After each game, I would slip away before the parents and players flooded the parking lot. I would walk to the bus stop, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in my ears, my heart a hollow ache in my chest. On the long ride back to the halfway house, I would piece together the fragments I had collected. A gesture of a hand, a domestic morning ritual, a mother's proud cheer. They were beautiful, painful shards of a life that was not mine. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they were the only pieces I would ever have. My life had settled into a routine of quiet observation. I was a planet, held in a distant, lonely orbit around the vibrant sun of my daughter's family. The days were measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the stolen glimpses of their lives, the departure of a school bus, the closing of a gallery door, the arc of a soccer ball against an autumn sky. My small room at the halfway house was my observatory, a place of silent reflection, its single window looking out onto a brick wall that had become a strange sort of comfort, a mirror to the dead end of my own existence. I expected nothing from the world. I had learned over 4 decades that expectation was the precursor to pain. The world, however, had one last surprise for me. It arrived on a Tuesday. The manager of the house, a perpetually tired man named Sal, called my name from the front desk. His voice, a gravelly monotone, was usually a harbinger of some new rule or a random room inspection. I went downstairs, expecting nothing. In the dim lobby, sitting on the scuffed linoleum floor, was a cardboard box. It was a standard-issue storage box, its sides slightly bowed, its corners softened with age. It was sealed with wide strips of yellowed packing tape, now dry and brittle. Scrawled on the side in faded black marker was my name, Arthur Morgan, and below it, a long string of numbers that had once been my entire identity. Inmate, Dexter's 734-006. Sal grunted and pointed a thumb at the box. It had been in the prison's long-term storage facility for 41 years. My property. I stared at it. It was a coffin, and inside were the bones of a man I had once been. Carrying it up the 4 flights of stairs felt like a pilgrimage. The box was not heavy, but it had a strange density, a psychic weight that made my arms ache. I placed it in the exact center of my small room, on the worn patch of carpet between the bed and the desk. For the rest of the day, I just looked at it. It was an alien object in my Spartan world. It radiated a silent energy, a hum of dormant memories. To open it felt like a violation. That man, the Arthur Morgan who had packed this box, was a stranger to me. He was a man who had a wife, a child, a career. He was a man who had made a single catastrophic mistake that had unwritten his entire existence. I was his ghost, and I was terrified of what I might find inside his tomb. As dusk settled, painting the brick wall outside my window in shades of orange and purple, I finally found the will to act. I used my room key to saw through the brittle tape. The sound it made as it ripped was loud in the silent room, a dry tearing sound like old ligaments snapping. I lifted the cardboard flaps. A smell rose from the box, the scent of time itself. It was the smell of dry paper, of aging leather, of trapped, stagnant air. It was the smell of a life sealed away from the world. I reached in, and my fingers touched something cool and metallic, wrapped in worn leather. I pulled it out and set it on the floor. It was a roll, tied with a leather thong. I untied the knot, and the leather uncurled with a soft sigh. Inside, nestled in velvet slots, were my drafting tools, my compasses, my ruling pens, my precision dividers. They were German steel, perfectly weighted, instruments of creation. I picked up a heavy, silver compass. The cold, familiar weight of it in my palm was a shock. My hand, which now trembled when I tried to sign my name on parole documents, had once been steady enough to draw a perfect circle with this tool. I remembered the feeling of its sharp point, biting into a fresh sheet of vellum, the satisfying scratch of the graphite tip as it carved a clean, confident arc. I remembered the smell of the blueprints, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a structure rise from the abstract geometry of lines on a page. I had built things. I had made things that occupied space in the world. Now, I was a man who barely occupied his own skin. Beneath the tools was a stack of books, a well-worn copy of a history of architecture, its pages soft and dog-eared, a slim volume of poetry, its margins filled with notes written in a confident, slanted hand that I barely recognized as my own. The thoughts of this younger Arthur were a mystery to me. He had been passionate, opinionated, full of ideas. I felt no connection to him. He was a character in a book I had forgotten reading. Then I found a photograph. Its colors faded to a nostalgic sepia. It was me and my wife, Helen. It was taken before Elizabeth was born, on a trip to the coast. We were young, impossibly young, squinting into a bright sun, our arms around each other. Helen was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair a wild halo in the sea breeze. Looking at her face, I felt a grief so profound it was a physical pressure in my chest. I remembered the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the sharp wit, the way she had looked at me as if I were the only man in the world. I also remembered the arguments, the stress, the hairline fractures in our foundation that my crime had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. At the very bottom of the box, I found them. A small bundle of letters, tied with a single faded blue ribbon. I recognized Helen's elegant, looping handwriting on the envelopes. She had written to me every week for the first year. The ribbon disintegrated into dust as I tried to untie it. The letters felt impossibly fragile in my hands, brittle with age. I sorted through them. The early ones were full of frantic energy, of legal strategies and desperate hope. Then the tone shifted. Hope was replaced by a grim resignation. The letters grew shorter, the spaces between them longer. And then I found the one I had been dreading and expecting. It was different from the others. The envelope was thin, almost translucent, the kind used for airmail. The blue paper within was covered in her familiar script, but the words felt like they had been written by a stranger. I did not need to read the entire letter. I had memorized it 40 years ago. It was a brand on my soul. But I unfolded it anyway, the creases as sharp and painful as paper cuts. My eyes scanned the page, drawn by a morbid gravity to the key phrases, the words that had defined the rest of my life. Told her there was an accident, a highway collapse on a job site. It is a mercy, Arthur, a kindness you cannot understand from where you are. She will grow up with the memory of a hero, a brilliant architect who died tragically, not with the shame of a father who is a convict. She weeps for a dead man. It is a clean grief, a noble grief. I beg you, Arthur, for the love you ever had for her, do not take that away. Do not write. Do not try to contact her. Let her live her life. Let your ghost rest in peace. I let the letter fall from my fingers. It fluttered to the floor, landing beside the architect's tools. The room was now full of ghosts. The ghost of the young man who had once had a brilliant future. The ghost of the beautiful woman who had made an impossible choice. The ghost of the father who had agreed to his own execution. The weight of that decision, made in a moment of utter despair in a visitor's room 4 decades ago, came crashing down on me. I had not simply been absent. I had been a willing accomplice in my own erasure. My quiet, secret observations of my daughter's life were not a harmless act of a lonely old man. They were a betrayal of a sacred, 40-year-old promise. I was a ghost who had refused to stay in his grave. I sat on the floor in the deepening twilight, surrounded by the fragments of my former life. The letter, a pale square of condemnation in the gloom. I had opened Pandora's box, and the only thing left inside was the suffocating, absolute truth of my own complicity. The discovery of the letter in the cardboard box had changed the nature of my haunting. My secret observations of my daughter's life, which had once felt like a sad but necessary act of a forgotten father, now felt like a transgression. I was not just a ghost. I was a perjurer, a man who had broken a sacred 40-year-old vow. The promise I had made to my wife, Helen, to remain a ghost for the sake of our child, was a sentence I had agreed to serve long after my prison sentence had ended. By attending my grandson's soccer game, by inserting myself even at the farthest periphery of their world, I had violated the terms of my own spiritual parole. A profound and suffocating guilt settled over me, and I stopped my pilgrimages. The daily bus rides to the suburbs ceased. I no longer stood across the street from the gallery. I confined myself to my small room, a self-imposed solitary confinement, and waited. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime listening for the sound of approaching footsteps, that there would be a consequence. It came a week later, not as a text message, not with the cold, impersonal ambiguity of her first communication. This was different. Sal, the house manager, called me to the front desk. He held out a slip of paper. A woman had called for me. Elizabeth Morgan. He had written down the message verbatim. She would meet me the next day at 3 o'clock. There was an address for a coffee shop downtown, a place I did not know. There was no request, no question. It was a summons. The formality of it, the coldness of having the message delivered by a third party, told me everything I needed to know. This was not a meeting of a father and a daughter. It was an arraignment. The next day, I walked to the address. It was a gray, overcast afternoon, the sky the color of unpolished steel. The city seemed to amplify my own sense of dread. The shriek of a siren, the jarring hiss of a bus's air brakes, the impatient honking of a car horn. Every sound was a nerve ending being frayed. I felt exposed. Every pedestrian on the crowded sidewalk a potential juror, their passing glances a judgment. The coffee shop was a new, modern building of glass and black steel, a place designed to be seen into. There were no dark corners, no shadowed booths to hide in. It was a place of total exposure, a clinical setting for what I knew would be a clinical execution. I was early. I chose a small, sterile table for two and sat down, my back to the wall. I did not order anything. I simply sat and waited, my hands resting on the cold surface of the table. I watched the door. When she arrived, exactly at 3, my breath caught in my chest. She was not the mother from the soccer field or the party hostess. She was a woman dressed for war. She wore a dark, severe business suit. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was a pale, emotionless mask. She moved through the coffee shop with a brisk, purposeful stride, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. She did not hesitate. She walked directly to my table and sat down in the chair opposite me. She did not remove her coat. She placed her expensive leather purse on the empty chair beside her. The message was clear. This would not take long. For a long moment, we sat in perfect, ringing silence. The cheerful hum of the coffee shop, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of other conversations. It all faded away, leaving only the vast, frozen expanse of the small table between us. I looked at her face, searching for some flicker of the child she had been, for some trace of the woman from the gallery. I found nothing. Her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes were not. The polite indifference from our first meeting was gone. The panicked fear from the party was gone. They had been burned away, leaving behind something hard and cold and final. It was an anger so profound it had become a kind of crystalline stillness. It was the anger of a goddess whose temple had been defiled. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and devastating. She reached into her purse and took something out. She placed it on the table between us and slid it across the cold surface until it stopped directly in front of me. It was a photograph, printed on glossy paper. The image was slightly blurry, taken from a distance with a telephone. It was me. I was standing by the chain-link fence at the soccer field, a lonely, hunched figure in a cheap jacket, my face turned towards the game. It was the evidence of my crime. Exhibit A. I stared at the photograph, unable to look up at her. I had been seen. My careful, ghostly presence had been a clumsy intrusion. I had been caught. I felt a hot wave of shame wash over me, a blush that crawled up my neck and spread across my face. I had nothing to say. There were no words of defense. I was guilty. When I finally forced myself to look up, her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. And then, without a single word, she began to deliver her verdict. Her hands resting on the table were perfectly still, but her eyes moved, cataloging me, dissecting me. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was dismissive. It was the look one gives to an insect, a piece of filth that has appeared where it does not belong. She made a slight, almost imperceptible gesture with her head, a motion that encompassed the photograph, my presence in this coffee shop, my very existence. The gesture was a scythe, and it cut me out of the picture of her life. Her lips, a thin, pale line, tightened. I could see the muscles in her jaw working. She was communicating with a clarity that transcended language. You were not invited. You were not wanted. You stalked my son. You brought your ugliness, your past, your shame to a place that was innocent. You are a danger. I sat there and absorbed it all. I was a defendant in the dock, listening to a sentence I knew I deserved. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply let her silent, righteous fury wash over me, scouring me clean of any last, lingering hope. Her gaze intensified. She leaned forward ever so slightly, the last vestiges of her control beginning to fray. The glacial calm in her eyes cracked, revealing the molten rage beneath. And in that final searing look, she communicated the last unspoken clause of her judgment. The one from the letter, the one that had been the foundation of her entire life. You should have stayed dead. Then, it was over. She leaned back, the verdict delivered. She picked up her purse. She stood, her movements as precise and economical as they had been upon her arrival. She did not look at me again. She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, her back ramrod straight, a figure of absolute, unwavering finality. She did not look back. I remained at the table, a statue carved from shame. The photograph was still in front of me, a testament to my crime. The low hum of the coffee shop slowly returned to my awareness. A few people at nearby tables glanced at me, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pity, before quickly looking away. I had become a source of social discomfort, an island of misery in their cheerful afternoon. I do not know how long I sat there. Eventually, I stood up. I left the photograph on the table. It belonged to her world, not mine. The walk back to the halfway house was a journey through a ghost town. The city was still full of people, of cars, of noise, but I was aware of none of it. The world had become a silent, gray film. The collision was over. She had walked away unscathed, and I was wreckage. I had lost everything, all over again. The days following the collision in the coffee shop were a descent into a place beyond despair. Despair, I had learned, is an active state. It has a heat, a churning energy. This was something else entirely. It was a cold, silent, and absolute void. My daughter's final silent verdict had been a judgment not just on my actions, but on my very existence. You should have stayed dead. The words, though unspoken, had become the new architecture of my reality. I had been hollowed out, my inside scoured clean, leaving only a fragile, brittle shell. My room at the halfway house became a tomb. I ceased my wanderings. The city outside my window held nothing for me anymore. I would sit for hours on the edge of my thin mattress, my hands lying limp in my lap, and stare at the brick wall. It was no longer a metaphor for my confinement. It was a reflection of my soul. Opaque, impenetrable, a final, absolute end. I stopped going to the soup kitchen. The act of eating felt like a betrayal of the verdict, an obscene insistence on living when I had been so thoroughly erased. The physical hunger was a dull, distant ache, easily ignored. The emptiness inside me was far more vast and consuming. The box of my old belongings sat in the corner of the room, a sarcophagus I did not dare to touch again. Its contents, the ghosts of the man I had once been, were too painful to confront. They were relics of a life that had been pronounced a mistake. My mind, which had been my only refuge for 4 decades, had become a torture chamber. The 10-second encounter in the gallery, the panicked look on her face at the party, the cold, crystalline fury in her eyes at the coffee shop. These moments played on a relentless, silent loop, each viewing a fresh application of the lash. In the deepest recesses of that void, an old, familiar thought began to stir. It was a thought I had not entertained since my first few years inside, a thought born of absolute hopelessness. The bus station. It called to me not as a place of escape to a new life, but as a place of final surrender. I could buy a ticket, any ticket, to a city outside the state lines. The act of crossing that border would be an instant violation of my parole. It would be a clean, efficient act of self-destruction. The system would find me. I would be returned to a world I understood. A world of concrete and steel, of bells and bars, of a predictable, numbing routine where the future was a known quantity. Prison was a kind of death, yes, but it was a death I had already survived. This new life, this freedom that was a wilderness of pain and rejection, was unsurvivable. The thought was a dark, soothing balm. It was a way to finally honor her silent command. I would die again. I do not know what stopped me. Perhaps it was the memory of the German steel drafting compass in my hand. Perhaps it was the ghost of the architect, buried under 41 years of shame, stirring one last time. But on the 3rd day of my self-imposed fast, instead of walking towards the bus station, my feet turned in a different direction. I was not guided by a conscious decision, but by a deep, magnetic pull towards the only thing in the world that still bore my name without shame. I was going to see my last building. The journey was a pilgrimage through the ruins of my own memory. I took a series of buses, traveling across a city that was a palimpsest of my past. I saw street corners where buildings I remembered had been torn down, replaced by towers of alien glass. I saw parks that had been paved over, neighborhoods that had changed their names and their identities. I was a ghost, moving through a city of ghosts. After 2 hours, I arrived. I stood across the street from the Mercantile Trust Bank building. It had been the crowning achievement of my young career, the project that was supposed to have been the beginning of everything. And it had been the end. It was still beautiful. I had designed it to be timeless, to speak a language of permanence and stability. It was clad in a warm gray granite, its lines clean and strong, rising 30 stories against the overcast sky. It was a building of substance, of quiet, unshakable dignity. It had stood here for more than 40 years, weathering summer suns and winter freezes, watching the city around it transform. It had endured. I crossed the street, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. I approached not as a tourist, but as a creator returning to his creation. I stopped at the base of the massive granite wall that flanked the main entrance. I reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the stone. The shock of the contact was immediate and profound. The stone was cool, solid, and real. I could feel the subtle, chiseled texture under my fingertips, a pattern I had spent a week perfecting on the blueprints. This was real. I had made this. In a world where my entire identity felt like a fiction, a shameful story best left untold, this building was a fact. It was a testament, written in stone and steel, that I had once existed, that I had once been capable of creating something of strength and beauty. I walked the perimeter of the building, my hand trailing along the wall. I looked at the way the bronze window casings had aged, developing a rich, greenish patina, just as I had calculated they would. I looked at the massive bronze doors, their surfaces worn smooth by the touch of a million hands. I reached out and took hold of one of the heavy, custom-designed door handles. the cool solid weight of it in my palm, was an anchor. I had designed this. I had sketched its shape on paper, and now it was here, a solid thing in the world, performing its simple, elegant function every single day. I stood before the main entrance, looking through the thick glass into the lobby. I saw the soaring, vaulted ceiling, the marble floors, the way the light from the high windows illuminated the space, exactly as I had envisioned it. The building was alive. It was breathing. It was serving its purpose. It had a quiet, profound integrity. And in that moment, standing before the one great achievement of my life, the nature of my own ruin became clear. I had been trying to rebuild a structure that was irreparable. My relationship with my daughter was not a building that needed renovation. It was a ruin, a foundation shattered beyond repair. My every clumsy attempt to place a new stone, to add a new timber, only caused more of the crumbling structure to collapse. A new thought began to form, a thought born not of despair, but of the quiet dignity of the stone and steel before me. I could not rebuild her past. I could not insert myself into her present, but I could perhaps offer a final piece of myself, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an explanation, not the broken, hollowed-out man who stood here today, but the man who had designed this building, the architect, the creator, the father she had never known. My final act could not be one of emotional desperation. It had to be one of careful, deliberate design. I could not build a bridge, but I could send a final silent message across the chasm, a blueprint of a life that had been, before it was unwritten. I let my hand fall from the bronze door handle. I took one last look at my building, standing proud against the gray sky. The sun was beginning to set, and the lights within the lobby were beginning to glow, a warm and inviting promise of order and purpose. The despair in my chest had not vanished, but it had receded. The void was still there, but now, in its center, a single tiny point of light had appeared. A plan. I turned away from the building. My walk to the bus stop was different. My feet felt steady on the pavement. My gaze was no longer fixed on the ground. I was still a man in ruins, but I was an architect again. And I had one last, small, and profoundly important thing to build. The visit to the building had changed the chemistry of my despair. The profound, suffocating vacuum that had followed the confrontation with my daughter remained, but its nature had shifted. It was no longer a passive state of surrender, but a quiet, clean emptiness, a space that was waiting to be filled with one final, deliberate act. The architect in me, the part of my soul I had thought long dead and buried under 41 years of institutional grime, had been reawakened. I had returned to my room at the halfway house not with a sense of hope, but with a sense of purpose. I was an architect of ruins, and I had one last design to execute. My movements the next morning were different. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused precision. I made my bed, pulling the thin gray blanket taut and folding the corner with a crisp, geometric neatness I had not bothered with since my release. I cleared the small, scarred surface of my desk, wiping it clean with a damp cloth. I was preparing a workspace. Then I turned to the cardboard box in the corner. Pandora's box. This time, when I approached it, it was not with the dread of an archaeologist disturbing a tomb, but with the resolve of an archivist selecting items for a final, definitive collection. I was not there to commune with ghosts, but to give them a proper burial. I knelt on the floor and carefully lifted the contents out, setting each item aside until I found what I was looking for. My old sketchbook. It was bound in dark, worn leather, its cover softened to the texture of a glove. The title embossed in faded gold leaf, A. Morgan, Architectural Studies. I held it in my hands. It was heavier than I remembered, dense with the weight of old dreams. I sat at the desk and opened it. A faint, dry smell of graphite, paper, and time rose from the pages. I began to turn them, one by one. The sketchbook was a time capsule of a mind I had once inhabited. The early pages were full of the clumsy, ambitious drawings of a student, shaky perspectives of classical columns, anatomical studies of gargoyles, a dozen failed attempts to render the perfect arch. I saw the ghost of my own youthful frustration and determination in the smudged graphite and erased lines. As I moved deeper into the book, the drawings became more confident. There was a series of charcoal studies of bridge trusses, their powerful geometric forms rendered with a stark beauty. There was a detailed ink drawing of a proposed public library, a building of light and soaring spaces that had never been built. I saw in these pages a young man who believed in the power of structure and form, a man who believed that a well-designed building could bring order and beauty to a chaotic world. He was a stranger to me, this passionate, optimistic man, but I recognized the precision of his hand. It was the one part of him that I had managed to carry with me through the long, dark years. Near the back of the book, I found them, a series of sketches for a house. It was a project I had worked on in my spare time, a private dream. It was a modern design, a composition of glass and wood and stone, nestled into a hillside overlooking a body of water. It was a house designed to capture the light, with large windows and open spaces. It was a family home. On the corner of one of the floor plans, a detailed layout of a child's bedroom, there was a small handwritten note, the ink faded almost to invisibility. For Lizzie. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I had forgotten this. I had designed this house for her, a 7-year-old girl who loved to climb trees and look at the stars. The bedroom had a skylight directly over the bed. I remembered the thought process, the love that had been poured into every line. This sketchbook was not just a record of my professional ambitions. It was a testament to a future that had been incinerated in a single, thoughtless moment of rage. I carefully closed the sketchbook. This was the legacy, not the story of the inmate, the failed father, the ghost, but the story of the architect, the dreamer, the man who had designed a house with a skylight for his daughter. This was the piece of my history I could offer, without shame. This was the truth of who I had been. My hand went to the stack of old letters on my desk. I sifted through them until I found the one on the thin blue airmail paper. Helen's letter, the one that had pronounced me dead. I held the fragile document in my hands. The decision to include it was cold and clear. It was not an act of accusation, not an attempt to shift the burden of guilt onto my dead wife. She had done what she thought was necessary to protect our child, and who was I to judge her methods from the moral high ground of a prison cell? No, the letter was not an excuse. It was context. It was the missing piece of the blueprint. It explained the 40 years of silence. It explained why I had become a ghost. It was the key to understanding the architecture of our family's ruin. To offer the sketchbook without the letter would be to offer a beautiful but incomplete design. The truth, in all its painful complexity, was all I had left to give. I would include nothing else. No new letter from me, filled with the useless currency of apology and regret. No photographs. No pleas for a second chance. My presence, I now understood, was the source of the pain. This final communication had to be entirely about the past, a curated exhibit delivered without a curator. It was a final, silent offering, an act of explanation, not of supplication. It was an act of letting go. The physical preparation of the package was the last design project of my life. I used the last of my cash to buy a sturdy cardboard box and a roll of plain brown wrapping paper from a small convenience store. Back in my room, I worked with a quiet, focused intensity. I wrapped the leather sketchbook first, folding the corners of the paper with a geometric precision I had not used in decades. I placed the fragile blue letter inside the front cover of the book. I sealed the package with tape, running my thumb over the edges to ensure they were perfectly smooth. I addressed it in my neat, architectural block letters to Elizabeth Morgan at the gallery's address. It was a formal, respectful address to a woman I didn't have the right to call my daughter. I walked to the post office with the package held in both hands. It was not heavy, but it contained the entire weight of my life. The air outside was cool and crisp, and the sky was a clean, empty blue. At the post office, I waited in line, an anonymous old man holding a brown paper parcel. When my turn came, I placed the box on the scale. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, processed it without a word. I paid the postage, slid the coins across the counter, and watched as she affixed the label and tossed the box into a large canvas bin behind her. And just like that, it was gone. It was no longer mine to carry. I turned and walked out of the post office, back into the bright, indifferent afternoon. My hands were empty. A strange, unnerving lightness spread through my chest. The burden was gone. I did not know where I would go next. I did not know what, if anything, would happen. And for the first time in a very long time, I found that I did not care. I had designed my final structure, a legacy of truth, and had sent it out into the world. The architect of ruins was, at last, at peace. My name is Elizabeth Morgan. I have built my life on the principles of control and curation. My gallery is a testament to this, a clean, quiet, white-walled space where every object is placed with intention, every shadow and every line contributing to a harmonious, deliberate whole. My home is the same. My family, my career, my past, all are elements in a carefully composed narrative. I am the director of my own existence. On the evening the package arrived, I was working late, enjoying the profound and satisfying silence of the gallery after the last of the patrons had departed. My assistant had left the parcel on the polished surface of my large, minimalist desk. It was a simple, anonymous object, wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to me in a hand I did not recognize. The script was precise, angular, the block letters of an engineer or an architect. I assumed it was an unsolicited submission from an artist, another hopeful soul sending their life's work into the void. With a sigh of mild annoyance, I picked up a silver letter opener and slit the tape. The wrapping paper fell away to reveal a sturdy cardboard box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that was yellowed with age, was a single object, a leather-bound sketchbook. It was old, the dark leather worn smooth and supple at the corners, the cover embossed with a name in faded gold leaf that was almost illegible. I lifted it out. It had a pleasing weight, a density that spoke of quality and use. I felt a flicker of professional curiosity. I am a curator, after all, and I have a deep and abiding respect for well-made objects. I sat down in my leather office chair and opened the book. The paper inside was thick and creamy, the color of old ivory. And the drawings. The drawings stopped my breath. They were magnificent. The hand that had made them was not just skilled, it was brilliant. The early pages were filled with technical studies, anatomical renderings of bridges and trusses, exercises in perspective that were so precise, they seemed to hum with a kind of mathematical music. I turned the pages with a growing sense of wonder. There were designs for public buildings, sketches of soaring facades and light-filled atriums, notes in the margins about the tensile strength of steel and the properties of reinforced concrete. This was not the work of some unknown amateur. This was the work of a master, a man who thought in lines and structures, a man who understood the poetry of a well-designed space. I felt a strange sense of kinship with the unknown artist. This was a language I understood. I moved deeper into the book, and the drawings became more personal. There were landscapes, detailed renderings of coastlines and mountain ranges, drawn with a sensitive, confident hand. And then, I found the house. It was a series of sketches, a full conceptual design for a modern home. It was beautiful, a composition of glass and wood that was designed to merge with a natural hillside. It was a home filled with light and air, a place of peace and beauty. My professional eye admired the clean lines and the intelligent use of space, but then my personal world tilted on its axis. In the corner of a detailed floor plan, beside the drawing of a child's bedroom with a large skylight, was a handwritten note in the same precise architectural script. For Lizzie. Lizzie. No one had called me that since I was a little girl. My mother, my father, in the dim, fragmented memories I had of him before he was gone. I stared at the note, my heart beginning a low, frantic drum against my ribs. I looked back at the faded gold embossing on the cover of the sketchbook. I could make it out now. A. Morgan, Arthur Morgan, the name of the old man. The strange, sad man who had appeared at my gallery, who had stood like a ghost at my birthday party. The man I had so coldly, so efficiently, cut out of my life. My mind refused to make the connection. It was impossible. A coincidence. A cruel joke. My hand was trembling as I continued to turn the pages, a new, desperate urgency guiding me. Tucked into an envelope flap inside the back cover, I found it. A single folded sheet of thin, blue airmail paper. It was old, the creases sharp and threatening to tear. It was not addressed to me. The envelope it must have come in was gone, but the letter itself was addressed to an inmate number at a state penitentiary. And the handwriting. I knew that elegant, looping script better than my own. It was my mother's. A cold dread, unlike anything I had ever known, washed over me. This felt like a violation, like reading a diary, like trespassing on sacred ground. But I could not stop. I unfolded the letter. The paper was so fragile it felt like it might disintegrate at my touch, and I began to read. The words were a quiet, methodical demolition of my entire life. My mother's familiar handwriting formed sentences that did not compute, that my brain could not, or would not, parse. But they were there, undeniable, written in faded blue ink. I read about an accident that had never happened. I read about a lie, constructed out of what she had called mercy. I read the words, "I told her you died." I read the phrases, "a hero, not a convict," and "a clean grief." I read her plea, her desperate, loving, terrible plea to the man who was my father. "Let her remember you dead. I beg you, Arthur. Do not write. Do not take that away from her." The letter fell from my fingers and drifted onto the polished surface of my desk. The silence of the gallery was suddenly absolute, a crushing pressure. The room, my sanctuary of order and control, began to spin. I gripped the arms of my chair. My life, the carefully curated narrative of Elizabeth Morgan, daughter of a brilliant, tragically deceased architect, was a forgery, a lie, a kind, well-intentioned, and monstrous lie. My father had not died. He had been in a cage. For my entire life, he had been in a cage, while I had been mourning a hero. A storm broke inside of me, a hurricane of emotions so violent it left me breathless. There was a white-hot rage at my mother, at the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her deception, at the loving cruelty of her decision. There was a profound, disorienting confusion. My entire identity, the bedrock of my past, had turned to sand. I was the daughter of a convict. And then, worst of all, came the wave of guilt. It was a physical thing, a crushing weight that settled on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. My own actions, my own cold, dismissive cruelty, were cast in a new, horrific light. The blank look at the gallery, the icy fury in the coffee shop, the silent command for him to disappear. I had been condemning him, not for the crime he had committed 41 years ago, but for the crime of being alive. I had looked at my own father, a man who had honored my mother's terrible wish for 4 decades, a man who had served a life sentence of silence for my benefit, and I had told him to go back to his grave. I had been my mother's unwitting, final gatekeeper. My gaze fell upon the sketchbook again. It was no longer a beautiful object from an unknown artist. It was a legacy. It was the soul of the father I had never known. I saw the passion, the genius, the love in every line. I saw the house with the skylight, a dream he had built for me, a future that had been stolen from us both. I sat alone in my dark, silent gallery, surrounded by the beautiful, valuable, and meaningless objects I had spent my life collecting. On my desk lay the only two things that were real: a book of dreams and a letter of lies. My life was a forgery, and I had just delivered the final, killing blow to the one person who had known the truth all along. In the weeks that followed the sending of the package, I lived in a state of quiet suspension. The act of mailing the sketchbook and the letter had been a final, definitive surgery, a removal of a tumor of hope and regret that I had carried for 41 years. In its place was a clean, hollow emptiness. It was not a painful void, but a peaceful one. I had said my final piece. I had submitted my final design. I expected nothing in return. The world had given me no reason to expect kindness, and I had long since unlearned the habit of hope. My days became a simple, unburdened routine. I fulfilled the requirements of my parole with the detached efficiency of a man completing a final checklist. I went to the parole office. I filled out job applications for menial positions I knew I would never get. I ate my meals. I returned to my room. But the ghosts were gone. The constant looping replay of my failures had ceased. The silence in my mind was, for the first time, a silence of peace, not of despair. I made a decision. My presence in this city was a loose thread, a historical anomaly that could only cause further disruption. My daughter, Elizabeth, deserved to live her life without the constant, low-grade threat of my existence on her periphery. I was a ghost who had overstayed his welcome among the living. I filled out the paperwork to have my parole supervision transferred to another state, a place where the name Arthur Morgan meant nothing, a place with no history, no landmarks of my shame. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but for the first time, the system's impersonal grind felt like an ally, a machine that was helping me achieve a final, orderly erasure. My departure was set for a Tuesday in September. On that final day, my bus was scheduled to leave in the evening. I packed my few belongings into a small, worn suitcase I had bought at a thrift store. My room, already Spartan, now looked utterly barren. The cardboard box of my past was empty. I had kept nothing but a change of clothes and the faded photograph of a 7-year-old girl. With several hours left before I had to leave, I stepped out into the city for a final walk. It was not a sentimental journey. It was a farewell to a city that had been my home, my crime scene, and my purgatory. I walked without a destination, letting my feet carry me through the familiar grid of streets. But a strange, quiet gravity began to pull at me, and I found myself walking in a direction that was both an old habit and a final, necessary goodbye. I was walking towards her gallery. I had no intention of seeing her, no desire to cause another scene. I simply needed to look at the building one last time, to close the book at the place where the final chapter had been written. I approached the street from the opposite end, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The neighborhood was as I remembered it, a world of quiet elegance and understated wealth. As I drew closer to the gallery, I noticed something was different. The main display window, a huge pane of glass that always showcased a significant and challenging piece of modern sculpture, was not the same. The large twisted metal form that had been there for weeks was gone. The window looked almost empty, which was a violation of every principle of gallery curation. My steps slowed. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. I thought for a wild moment that perhaps the gallery had closed. I stopped on the sidewalk directly in front of the window, and what I saw made the world fall away. The display space was not empty. It had been deliberately minimalist ally curated to hold a single object. In the precise center of the vast space, placed on a stark white pedestal and illuminated by a single, perfectly focused spotlight from the ceiling, was my sketchbook. It was open. From where I stood, I could see the worn, dark leather of the cover and the creamy, yellowed pages within. It was treated not as a book, but as a sculpture. It was presented as a work of art. My work, my life, my secret history, sitting in a pool of light for the entire world to see. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. My mind struggled to process the sight. This was an act of impossible grace. It was a communication in the only language she had ever known me to speak, the language of form, of presentation, of curated meaning. She had taken the shattered fragments of my past, the story I had offered in shame and despair, and she had declared it to be art. She had taken the work of the convict, the ghost, the failure, and she had placed it in the heart of her beautiful, successful world. She had given it a place of honor. I took a half-step closer to the glass, my reflection a ghostly, transparent old man superimposed over the display. I could see the page to which the book was open. It was the drawing of the house, the dream house, the house with the note in the corner. For Lizzie. My vision blurred. A feeling I could not name, a feeling that was equal parts crushing grief and an expansive, soaring gratitude rose up in my chest. I had been seen. After a lifetime of being invisible, of being a number, of being a ghost, I had finally been seen. And then I saw her. She was standing inside the gallery, in the deep shadows just beyond the pedestal. She was a silhouette against the bright white walls of her kingdom. She did not move forward into the light. She simply stood there, watching me. Our eyes met through the thick, soundproof glass. The glass was a physical representation of the barrier that would always be between us, a permanent and necessary separation. But for the first time, we were looking at the same thing. We were sharing the same space, the same truth. Her face was not smiling. It was solemn, her expression etched with a sorrow and a wisdom that seemed to have aged her. It was the face of a woman who had seen the blueprints of her own life and had understood, finally, how it had been built. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she gave a single, slow, and almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of infinite complexity. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation to cross the threshold into her life. It was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement. It was a silent message that said everything that could not be said. I see you. I understand. I have received your legacy. The ruin is now complete. I felt a lifetime of tension release from my shoulders. The verdict was in. Not guilty, not innocent. Just understood. I raised my hand, a small, hesitant gesture, and returned the nod. Then I turned away. I did not look back. I picked up my small, cheap suitcase from the pavement where I had dropped it. I walked down the street, away from the gallery, away from the life of my daughter, towards the bus station. The sun was setting, casting the city in a warm, golden light. My shadow stretched out long before me. My hands were empty. My heart was at peace. I was still Arthur Morgan, a man who had built ruins, but I was no longer one of them.